Disclaimer. This video is a re-upload, created by our research analyst Johnny Rockermeyer. Consequently, its content does not necessarily reflect the opinion of Dr. Thomas Seyfried. The ideas of the RockSolid Diet are important for cancer patients, as new research shows, excess omega-6 consumption leads to severe damage to our mitochondria, the direct precursor to cancer. We will show you a study about this connection at the end of the video. We recommend that these groups adhere to the RockSolid Diet. People who are at high risk of cancer, due to their genetics, or whose parents or grandparents suffered from cancer. Cancer patients who are in remission and want to prevent cancer recurrence. In this case, a keto version of the RockSolid Diet would be the best option. If you want to implement the RockSolid Diet into your cancer management protocol, just go to school.com/keto for cancer, our new online community and education platform. Okay, now it's time to enjoy the video.
See? You can do it.
Hi there, my name is Johnny Rockermeyer from RockSolidDiet.com, and in this episode I will tell you what the RockSolid Diet is. More specifically, you will learn how you can use the RockSolid Diet to improve your omega-6 to 3 ratio. Because the RockSolid Diet is about avoiding the omega-6 fats that are in seed oils. Following the RockSolid Diet will prevent you of getting sick by the so-called diseases of civilization, like cancer, heart disease, diabetes and obesity. Let's take a look at the outline. In Chapter 1, you will learn about the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and why you can never get that ratio right. I will also tell you what the definition of rock solid exactly is. Chapter 2 is about the real cause of the DOCS, the diseases of civilization. As an example, we will talk about heart disease and Ansel Keys' diet-heart hypothesis. In the third chapter, you will learn what food items contribute the most to our omega-6 consumption and how much our current intake is. Chapter number 4 is about the animal fat anomaly. In Chapter 5, we will do the math on how much omega-6 you are actually allowed to eat. And finally, in Chapter 6, I will present to you my own homemade omega-6 calculator and show you how to use it.
I've made a lot of special modifications myself.
As you can see, this video has gotten quite long, so feel free to use the chapter markers in the description. Okay, let's go.
Concentrate. Good. Go. Yes.
When it comes to a healthy diet, you likely heard this phrase 1,000 times, coming from scientists and experts. What all of those guys want to tell you is, hey buddy, seems like nutrition science has figured out one thing for sure. If you want to live a healthy and happy life, you should eat less of those nasty omega-6s and more of those super awesome omega-3s. For the best health results, your ratio shouldn't be higher than 2:1, meaning 2 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. Yeah, that's what the experts say, but what is our current ratio? I gotta tell you, it's really bad. As you can see in this graph here, in 2000 we were already at 16:1, and now in 2020 we are at 20:1.
This is ridiculous.
And here's the ratio that experts recommend, 2:1. But yeah, what are you gonna do with that kind of information? How do you get that omega balance right? Are you going to supplement with fish oil? Before we go any further, let's quickly take a look at the sources of omega-3s and 6s in our food supply. As you may know, omega-3 fatty acids are predominantly in animal products, especially in fish and seafood, but also in meat, organs, dairy and eggs. These fatty acids are known as EPA and DHA. They are also labeled as PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Important fact, you can pretty much forget about plant sources of omega-3 like ALA. ALA has to be converted by our bodies to be usable. Unfortunately, the conversion rate is extremely low at around 4%. On the other hand, those plant omega-3 sources contain plenty of omega-6, so just forget about them. They only seem healthy at first glance. Omega-6s, on the other hand, are fatty acids that are predominantly in plant foods. We eat them normally in the form of grains and seeds, as these are pretty high in fat and so high in omega-6s. Examples of direct consumption would be our all-beloved wheat and wheat flour and pretty much all nuts. But the way in which we eat the most omega-6s is quite obvious. We eat them as oils. But only since the 19th century, since we humans invented a bunch of technologies to extract those fats and concentrate them. It's a very natural process. You may call them seed oils, vegetable oils, or cooking oils. Examples are sunflower oil, canola oil, or the famous and infamous soybean oil. We will also call them linoleic acid, because that's the most abundant omega-6 fatty acid in them. Okay, now that everybody's on the same page, let's get back to our ratio. The question still is, how do we get that omega-6 to omega-3 balance right? Everybody will tell you, yeah, increase those omega-3s, man, it's easy buddy, simply eat more fatty fish, or supplement with fish oil. The problem is, with our current omega-6 consumption, you can raise your omega-3 intake as much as you want. You will never ever get to a 2-to-1 ratio of those fatty acids. Want proof? Okay, how much omega-6 do you think we're eating in a day? What number can you imagine?
I don't know, I can imagine quite a bit.
Okay, let's see. This graph shows the omega-6 consumption in the United States from 1999 till 2009. And as you can see, in the United States, we are currently at 40 grams of omega-6 fatty acids per day. So, if you want to get this proper ratio of 2-to-1 and you don't want to change your omega-6 intake, then you would have to eat 20 grams of omega-3 fats, meaning about 67 fish oil capsules every single day.
What?
Okay. You don't want to swallow a couple dozen of fish oil capsules. You can, of course, just eat 2.5 pounds of salmon a day. Sure, you could do that. But come on, that's 1,000,000 calories. And it would cost you $10,000 a month.
10,000?
It's just a stupid idea overall. This huge imbalance between omega-6s and 3s is the reason that a lot of studies did not get any positive results. Because the few grams of omega-3s didn't stand a chance against a mountain of omega-6s. Now, the very best way to get that ratio right is to simply eliminate omega-6s as much as possible. And by the way, omega-6s have turned out to be extremely unhealthy. In the last years, a lot of research has come out that proves this.
It is the seed oils that are the primary drivers because they are the biological poisons.
There's so much good evidence that polyunsaturated fat is horrible for humans.
Seed oils, this thing that turns into a metabolic toxin in your body.
So it seems that all along it was not about the ratio, it was all about the avoidance of omega-6s that was the real health benefit. Long story short, omega-6s, also known as seed oils, PUFAs or linoleic acid, are poisonous, toxic, and a bunch of other very terrible things, so just don't eat them. As I said, a bunch of experts have figured this out. They are saying, stop eating seed oils, avoid them as much as possible. But here's the problem. Nobody ever tells you how to really do it. How should you eliminate them? Okay, you switch from cooking with sunflower oil to cooking with coconut oil, alrighty. But then, is that really enough? This is where the RockSolid Diet comes into play. It's all about eliminating omega-6s. You probably have asked yourself, what does the RockSolid Diet mean? What is it exactly?
What's this?
Well, RockSolid stands for ROCK, reduction of chronic sickness, through a SOLID, seed oil limitation diet. You could also say elimination diet. Yeah, obvious, right? It's as easy as that.
Easy? You call that easy?
The RockSolid Diet is about giving you practical advice and tools on how to reduce omega-6 fats in real everyday life. We will tell you how much omega-6 you can eat, how you can assess the omega-6 content of foods, and accordingly, what foods to buy and eat. Well, it's really rather what foods to not eat. Going back to the unhealthy aspects of these plant fats, why specifically should we limit those omega-6s anyway? Everybody has heard of the DOCS, the diseases of civilization. And there are plenty of explanations why they increased that much since the last 100-200 years. Because before then they didn't really exist. From a nutritional standpoint, it seems quite striking that the inception of omega-6s correlates greatly with all of our current diseases of civilization. Let's hear it from Dr. Chris Kenobi.
Hello there.
He's gonna tell us how these chronic diseases were not really a thing and how they developed into this big threat that they are today.
This is Jones' paper from 2011. And what it shows is that in 1900, the top 3 causes of death were all infectious disease. It was pneumonia, tuberculosis, GI infections, right? Whereas by 2010, 7 of the top 10 causes of disease are all chronic disease. Heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, type 2 diabetes, all that, right? Let's walk through heart disease over the last 200 years. So from Jones' paper, we know that in Boston, in the town of Boston, in 1811, there were no heart disease deaths listed. All right? There was 25 sudden deaths. Probably most of those were cardiac valvular. In the entire 19th century, there's 8 worldwide papers, reports essentially, of heart disease, extraordinarily rare disorder. 1897, Sir William Osler, famed physician of Johns Hopkins, he recounts his previous 21 years of hospital history, about 6 cases of angina, never seen an MI, never seen a heart attack. 1900, Jones' paper tells us 12.5% of people died of heart-related disease, but it was virtually all cardiac valvular. It was syphilis, endocarditis, rheumatic fever. It wasn't coronary artery disease related, right? 1912, John Harry publishes the first known case of heart attack in the United States, documented with autopsy evidence. 1930s though, heart disease becomes the leading cause of death. Virtually unknown 30 years earlier, all right? In fact, when John Herrick published the paper about the MI, it wasn't even taken seriously for about a decade, all right? Advance forward to 2010, 32% of Americans dying of heart disease, virtually 1 in 3, all right? So the increase looks something like that red line right there. Cancer, Boston, 1811, 1 in 188 people died of cancer. 1900, it's rising, 1 in 17 in the US. 2010, 31.1% of people die of cancer, right? That's almost, again, 1 in 3. So the increase looks something like this. And what I hear all the time is yeah, but we're getting older. I'm telling you, that does not explain this. So back to cancer here, 62-fold increase in cancer in 200 years. How about type 2 diabetes? We know in the 19th century, diabetes of any type was rare and presumably rare for all of history prior. 1935, it's rising, 0.37%. This continues to rise. And we're at 9.4% by 2015. This is a 25-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in 80 years. How about obesity? 19th century. We know that obesity was 1.2% in men, age 18 to 80, in Texas and Nebraska prisons, right? Okay, look at this. By 1960, we're at 13% obesity. That was a 10-fold increase already, right, when we thought we were lean. So this continues to rise, and by 2015, we're at 39.8% obesity, right? This is a 33-fold increase in obesity in about 115 years, and we are on target to be at 50% of Americans obese by 2030. That was published in JAMA just a few weeks ago.
In this graph, I summarized those numbers. As you can see, heart disease as the cause of death rose 12 times, from 2.6% to 32%. The prevalence of type 2 diabetes went from 0.4% to 10.5%, a 28x increase. And the worst disease of them all, cancer. Death by cancer increased from 0.5% to 31%, a truly staggering increase of 62 times. But I gotta tell ya, the usual suspects are not responsible for those rising disease rates. It's obviously not about our genetics. It's also not about calories or too little exercise. It's not even about sugar or fructose or insulin. Yeah, you heard me right, ladies and gentlemen. It is not about
Insulin. What do you mean?
So, what is it? Let's take a quick look at the case of heart disease. The mainstream explanation for heart disease is that we eat too much saturated fat. This saturated fat contains cholesterol. The cholesterol clogs our arteries, which researchers call atherosclerosis, and then we get a heart attack because of insufficient blood flow to the heart. This chain of events also works for strokes. This theory was popularized back in the 1960s by the scientist Ansel Keys. That's him as a young man, and here he is on the cover of Time magazine. He tried to prove this theory by a study that looked at the correlation between nutritional cholesterol and deaths by a heart attack. This study, the so-called 6-country study, was more or less the very first earthquake of nutrition science, because it was the first one that connected our choice of foods to a deadly disease. Here is his data from 1953. As you can see, Japan was the country with the best numbers. At the time of the study, the Japanese people ate the least amount of fat. Only about 5% of the calories came from fat. They also had the lowest rate of heart disease deaths. Only about 2 per 1,000 people died of a heart disease. On the contrary, and on top of the chart, is the United States. Those fat-loving Yankees, they ate about 35% of the calories from fat. Consequently, about 8 of 1,000 people died of a heart attack. That is 4 times the rate of Japan. Ansel Keys stated that the high fat percentage, the high cholesterol intake, was clearly the cause of all those heart disease deaths. A lot of studies were done, which all wanted to show that this connection really does exist. Although he didn't really have a biochemical mechanism how this should work.
This is not gonna work.
So, did those studies show what Mr. Keys wanted to prove? No. In the best controlled studies that were done, the correlation was inverse. The more saturated fat, meaning animal fat, was eaten, the less people died. But these data were oftentimes not published or only years after the end of the study. Nowadays, the correlation of cholesterol from diet and mortality goes like this. This is the real, unbiased data from the WHO themselves. The interpretation goes like in the chart from Ansel Keys. On the x-axis, you see the percent of saturated fat of total energy. On the y-axis, you see the death rate for CVD, meaning cardiovascular disease. And what does the red line tell us? Overall, the trend goes down. Down and not up. Meaning the more people eat saturated fat, the less they die of a heart attack. Here is the data for the women. It's exactly the same thing. The correlation is even a little bit more pronounced than in men. So, don't be afraid of animal fats. You know that meat won't hurt you. We've been eating meat for hundreds of thousands of years.
Act on instinct.
So, did or does the mainstream explanation of heart disease hold true? Is it the cholesterol, the saturated fat? Nope, no Baronimo. But what about Ansel Keys' super awesome 6-country study? In that one, the correlation was quite convincing, wasn't it? Well, turns out, if he had taken all the data that was available at the time, namely of 22 countries, the graph would have looked like this. Correlation?
Where is it?
So I'm trying to tell you, kid, it ain't there.
Who the heck are those guys eating about 30% of the calories in fat and still having very few heart attacks? C'est la France, monsieur et madame, c'est la France. Yes, the French like their fatty cuisine a lot. That's why this phenomenon was, and still is, called the French paradox. Well, it's no paradox at all if you know that cholesterol is not the cause of this stuff. All in all, there is no correlation whatsoever. Mr. Ansel Keys maybe was high as a kite when he was choosing the countries. Now, what is the real cause of atherosclerosis? You guessed it, too much omega-6. Because oxidized LDL, LDL being the cholesterol, is the first step in atherosclerosis. And as omega-6 fats oxidize the LDL cholesterol in our arteries, the omega-6 fats are the cause of atherosclerotic plaques in the first place.
Turns out that oxidized LDL and therefore the oxidation of N6 fats is essential to the initiation of atherosclerosis.
Now you know who the real villain is, omega-6. You don't want to die of a heart attack, you also don't want your arteries to clog up. Then stop eating them. But obviously, first you have to know where all of your omega-6 is coming from. That's what we're gonna talk about next, our current omega-6 consumption.
Everything's under control, situation normal. Everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you.
So, where do we get all that poisonous PUFAs from? This graph shows the percent that the particular food group is contributing to our omega-6 intake. As you may have suspected, vegetable oils contribute by far the biggest part, with 60%, followed by fats with 11%. Then, as you can see, also poultry has a fair share. 7% of all the omega-6 fats come from chicken and turkey. This may surprise you, as poultry is, after all, an animal source. So is pork, which also does contribute 4%. But we will talk about animal sources of omega-6 later on. Last but not least on this chart, we have the omega-6 coming from nuts and grains. Those also make up about 11%. What's not in this chart is dairy, eggs and beef. These food groups are under miscellaneous, and those contribute between 1 and 2% of omega-6. Furthermore, the following food groups contribute each less than 1% of our consumption. All fruits and all vegetables.
Nice, come on.
To make this a little bit more practical for you, in this table we have an example of how these food groups are actually packaged as a dish. Because people don't really eat or slurp their seed oils directly, we rather consume them as a meal ingredient. Avoid everything that has a big portion of it directly as seed oils. Mayonnaise has plenty of omega-6, that's pretty obvious. Also, salad dressing has a whole lot of seed oils in it. That shouldn't be all that surprising, as it's kind of liquidy and greasy. In general, you should be able to identify those sources pretty easily. Then avoid everything that is fried, cause the frying oils are almost always from vegetable oils. That's the reason why chicken and chicken dishes are number 1 on the list. The same goes for potato chips and, of course, French fries. Next on the list, the wheat flour grain-based desserts and dishes. What this category means is more or less donuts and other sweet flour dishes of that kind. Also non-sweet dough-based dishes like classic pizza. In general, in all of those dishes that use some kind of dough, seed oils are added. And yeah, also wheat itself, the wheat flour, has omega-6 in it. Then nuts. Those are probably self-explanatory. Nuts are very fatty, and their fat contains a huge amount of omega-6 fatty acids. Maybe you've asked yourself, why are pasta dishes also in this list? Is it really because of the wheat? Well, a little bit. But that's not really the major issue. The major issue with these dishes, similarly to the Mexican dishes on the list, is 1. The sauce that comes along with it, and 2. The chicken and pork meat that comes along with the dish. In this picture there is actually a tomato-based sauce, so this one is fine. With a classic bolognese dish, the issue is not with the sauce, it's the fatty meatballs, as we will see later. Okay, now that you know where all those nasty veggie omega-6s are hidden, we should take a very close look at those vegetable oils themselves.
Thank the maker, this oil bath is going to feel so good.
So, how much of the oils are actually omega-6 PUFAs? The chart I'm gonna show you consists of the 8 top sold vegetable oils in the US. I arranged them in ascending order of their omega-6 content. More specifically, their linoleic acid content. The first group is the super high omega-6 group, sunflower, soybean and cottonseed oil. They range between 62 and 50% omega-6. That means that of 100 grams of oil, 62%, meaning 62 grams, are actually linoleic acid. Then we have the high omega-6 group, peanut oil and canola oil. These may not be that high, but they still have much. Too much. Next up is the moderate omega-6 group, olive oil and palm oil. If you really have to use an oil that's liquid at room temperature, for example for your salad, you could use those. Unfortunately, there is a great bandwidth of the omega-6 content of olive oil. It can range from 3% up to 25%. So, only buy olive oil that has the PUFA content explicitly on the label. You should really stay below 10% omega-6, maybe even below 6%. For example, on this label here, the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, are explicitly stated. This olive oil here is a good one, but there are still better ones around. As a rule of thumb, you should not really eat anything that has above 6% of its fats as omega-6 fatty acids. Then we got good old coconut oil. Only 2% of coconut oil is linoleic acid. 2%.
That looks pretty good.
That means that coconut oil is the best oil/fat to cook with. Coconut oil is the clear winner here. Use it plentifully and prefer it over any other oil on this list. When you take a look at this chart, what could you change in your nutrition to get rid of all those high and super high omega-6 oils? Yes, it's possible to change your cooking oil, let's say to coconut oil, okay. But what about foods that you don't cook yourself? Probably getting rid of all those super high omega-6 oils is only possible by avoiding processed foods completely, isn't it? You're on the right track, young Padawan. Okay, let's summarize what we've learned so far. Let's see what foods we should avoid. Of course, avoid vegetable oils directly. Don't cook with them, don't put them in your salad. Then, as we've said in the slide with the dishes, avoid everything that contains a huge portion of seed oils. Mayonnaise, for example, and fatty sauces in general. Dressing has lots of omega-6s as well. Avoid everything that is fried, because 99.99% of the time a seed oil is used for the frying. This affects all of your fried chicken products, french fries and the like. Avoid seed oils in processed foods. You can spot it on the label. If there's some seed oil in there, don't buy it. Unfortunately, this stuff is in pretty much everything, I'm afraid. So don't think with your stomach.
Great, always thinking with your stomach.
Very important not only within the processed foods category but also at restaurants. Avoid dishes that are based on some kind of flour dough. The oil used to make the dough, the meal, more palatable is almost always a vegetable oil. In the US, that is first and foremost soybean oil. Here is where your classic pizza and donuts come into play. And last but not least, avoid all nuts. Even a handful is too much, as you will see later. Regarding cooking, in the worst case, when you are cooking at home, choose palm oil or a low PUFA olive oil for cooking. Or even better, choose coconut oil. Don't be afraid of the high saturated fat content. It won't harm you.
Everything's gonna be fine, trust me.
Let's change our point of view. It is probably easier to tell you what you can eat, right? You can eat lots of fruit. And you can have plenty of vegetables. Do it. As long as they are low fat, which are pretty much all veggies and fruit, you can have those as much as you want. As you may have figured out till now, the RockSolid diet is not necessarily a low-carb diet. Carbs per se are not our enemies. Yeah, I know, carbs have quite a bad reputation these days because of
insulin.
But in RockSolid Diet land, you can have them. Accordingly, you can also have classic carb sources. Try to stay with the low-fat ones like rice and potatoes. Then you can have dairy. Everything from fatty cheeses to milk to butter. Yes, go for it. And finally, you can have meat, fish and eggs. Those contain, after all, fatty acids from animal sources. So those are safe. Or are they? Well, let's take a closer look at animal fats. Maybe animal fats are not as healthy as we thought.
What are you talking about?
Now, regarding the omega-6 content of animal fats, you will oftentimes find charts on the internet like this one. Here we have pork fat, lard, as an animal fat source. And it shows that 10% of the fats is omega-6. And we also have butter with 3%. Butter has the same omega-6 content as beef fat in general. Beef fat is also called tallow. Okay, let's add those three values to our graph. However, is this data really valid? Are these the values we're looking for?
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
No, they're not. There is a dirty little secret regarding animal fats.
I have a very bad feeling about this.
As you may have heard Dr. Kenobi say, humans cannot metabolize those PUFAs.
We can't burn these for fuel properly. They're meant to be stored and used as signaling and structural molecules, particularly in the mitochondria, and they're not meant to be burned as fuel. We accumulate these, and they accumulate in your cells and in your mitochondria, and this is where they wreak havoc because it's polyunsaturated, and they're the ones that oxidize.
Again, the omega-6s just accumulate in our tissue and then they oxidize and oxidize. Humans are mammals and we can't metabolize these fatty acids, these PUFAs. Guess what? Pigs can't do it as well. So, as the production of soybeans has gone up dramatically in the last years and decades, so has the share of soy and other high omega-6 products in the feedstuff of our livestock. Lard has 10% omega-6? Well, that would be great. But this isn't the case anymore. We are past that. By far. Back in the day, pigs got barley to eat, especially in Europe. But now, in the US, pigs not only get a bunch of soy products as foodstuff, they also get plenty of corn. They even get the leftovers from distilleries, so-called DDGS, dried distillers grains. And of course, this stuff is super high in linoleic acid, omega-6 fats. As a consequence, the fatty acid composition of lard, of pork fat, is a completely different one. Just go to the US Department of Agriculture's own homepage and see it for yourself. When you look for lard, you really do get that 10.2% of linoleic acid, which is the 18 carbon minus 2 fatty acid you gotta look for. Yeah, so 10%. But that was the data in 1979. If you instead look for pork fat, you get the value from 2011. So you take a 100 gram chunk of pork fat and there is 66 grams of fat in it. Okay. Out of those 66 grams, 11.8 grams are linoleic acid, which amounts to a whopping 18%, which is a 80% increase. So this is the current status of lard, of pork fat, which also has been confirmed by a lot of recent studies. In a study from 2013, the control group, I repeat, the control group, had 18.7%. And the DDGS group, the group eating the leftovers from the distilleries, they had an astonishing 22.8% of their fat being linoleic acid. In a different study from 2016, the researchers experimented with varying amounts of these distiller grains. And they were able, I'm not kidding, to bring the omega-6 content up to an impressive 27.6%. That's way more than even canola oil has. What about piggies on pasture, I hear you say? Those must be effing awesome, right? Well, the lowest omega-6 value in a pig ever that I could find was in a Polish study. Those pigs had 8.6% linoleic acid in the fat of their muscle meat, although they were not fed on pasture. In all other studies I found higher values, so there's a lot of variation. Even wild boar had 12%. All in all, in my own research, I concluded that the average pork fat from both lard and muscle meat is probably around 17% omega-6 linoleic acid. Yes, it really seems kind of high, but this is the data we are going to use. It went from 10% in 1980 to 17% in 2020. A 70% increase. But what about everybody's favorite, good old chicken? We love you so much as seen on the digest chart. Does the chicken love us back? Not so much, unfortunately. But with chicken, it's a different story than with pork. Chicken hated you right from the beginning. The omega-6 content of chicken fat was always high as flying F. Here's what the USDA said in 1979. 19.5% linoleic acid. Again, canola oil level. But Can't we bring that number up? Sure. High 20% ranges are easily manageable if you give those sassy birds a bunch of additional seed oils to eat, as clever scientists have tried. In one study, the researchers really wanted to push the limits of time and space. The soybean group had 35% linoleic acid in the fat of the thighs, and the record holders were the lucky chicks fed sunflower oil. They reached mind-blowing 38.5%. Now you see why fried fatty chicken products are just the very worst thing that you can eat, and why its contribution is the biggest of all food groups. But what about pastured chicken? Meh, even pastured chickens reach 17% omega-6. In my humble opinion, looking at multiple studies and the official data of the USDA, the average omega-6 percentage of chicken fat is around 22%. This is less than peanut oil, but more than canola oil. Ladies and gentlemen, the real bummer is still to come. Bad omega-6s in the chicken turn over to their eggs too. Of course, this is well known as the chicken and egg problem. Egg yolks are full of linoleic acid. Conventional eggs have 15% of omega-6 in their fatty acids. That's pretty bad. But hey, you're surely gonna say, then I'll just eat pasture-raised eggs. Haha, dummy, those are healthy. Super healthy. Right? Won't work, amigo. Going full organic will only lower the omega-6 percentage from 15 to... what do you think? 5, 7, maybe 8%? 13.5% it is, which is a negligible difference. The eggs you think are super awesome and super healthy, yes, they are full of nutrients, and they're full of omega-6s too. So, that's it? You can't eat any animal protein or fat because of its omega-6 poisoning? No, my friend, it's not over yet. There may be some light at the end of the tunnel. What about beef? What about steaks? And what about burgers? Fortunately, cows and ruminants in general, those have a very special kind of bacteria in their gut that lets them convert the nasty omega-6s to safe fatty acids. This means that all meat from ruminants have very low omega-6 linoleic acid values. Therefore, meat products from cows, lamb, sheep, goat and the like have around 2 to 4% of omega-6. As well as their dairy products. Finally, some good news. And what? Fish, you ask? Well, fish has always more omega-3 than omega-6 in it, even the ones that are farmed. So, don't worry about fish, just eat it as much as you want. Alrighty, let us put all this data back into the oil graph and see what's really going on here. As you can see, the blue bars, this is the animal fat anomaly at its finest. Chicken, pork and eggs are now very bad food items and not really recommendable. Of course, it depends on how fatty the cut is. Again, my advice, avoid everything that's above 6% of omega-6, which eliminates everything except coconut, tallow and butter, as fats for cooking and consumption. Now that we've covered pretty much all animal protein and fat sources, let's go back in time. You remember that summary? Well, that would have worked for the 1960s, before we started feeding our livestock crappy food, especially corn and soy. This means we have to change the summary of the RockSolid diet. Quite a bit.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but now, with all this omega-6 in animal fats floating around, you also have to skip the following things. Meat from pork, meat from chicken, and eggs. Well, not 100%. It still depends on the fat content. Let's talk about how much omega-6 we should/could consume, at the most. where should we start this detective investigation? The problem is, we don't know what our ancestors ate for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. If they ate a lot of meat and very little plants, and it seems like that's the case, then the value would be very low. Why? Because animals didn't eat all the high omega-6 stuff that we feed them today as livestock. They were eating real organic food, the food that they were meant to be eating. Still, any calculations are very vague, but I will try to present to you a decent scientific way. But it's not gonna be that easy.
How am I ever going to explain this?
What we do know for sure is how many grams of omega-6 we eat today. And we also know what percentage of our adipose tissue is made out of omega-6. Then, another part of the puzzle. We do know what percentage of their adipose as omega-6 people had that did not eat like we eat today. So, people eating an ancestral diet. Maybe with that knowledge we could simply do the math on how much they ate, meaning how much omega-6 in grams a day. Let's hear it from Dr. Kenobi on his search for the adipose data.
The next thing I'm going to show you, I searched for 3 years to find this. You know what I wanted to know? What was the omega-6 fat in anybody's adipose who was on an ancestral diet? Anybody in the world. I finally found it. Tocopherols. Right here. 3.8%. It is off the chart low. Remember I said their omega-6 in their diet was roughly 1%? 3.8% people. This is where we should be. And this is what keeps you healthy.
Okay, this is a very important point. According to Dr. Kenobi, there is a study that investigated how much omega-6 ancestral people had in their tissue as a percentage. That's exactly what we are looking for. The omega-6 status of people that ate in a natural way and that were, of course, super healthy. People that still ate a non-westernized diet. So, this is the paper he's talking about. Cholesterol, coconuts and diet on Polynesian atolls. And on page 6 of the paper, there it is. Again, linoleic acid is the 18:2 fatty acid. And we got 3.8%, like Dr. Kenobi said. Meaning that of the fatty acids in their tissue, 3.8% were linoleic acid, omega-6. But there is not only this value, there are another two. What? These guys, measured in puka puka, they had 3.2%. And there is a control group, the New Zealand Europeans. Those guys were astoundingly even lower with 3.0%. Great, so we got these three values, that's a safe thing. But again, the control value from the New Zealand guys, this was from another paper. And of course, I took a look at that one too. It's this paper here. Studies on fatty acid composition of adipose tissue and blood lipids. And this study gives us another 3 data points. 2.6 for the Maoris, 3.2 for the Puka Pukans in Puka Puka, and 2.6% for the Puka Pukans in Rarotonga. Oh man, those Polynesian island and people names, they really make you wobbly around your lips. Additionally, in some other presentation, Dr. Kenobi talked about a paper that had examined the Swedish population. It's this one. The Swedes in this 1958 paper had 4% of omega-6 linoleic acid in their adipose tissue. Yes, that's a lot of numbers, I know. And maybe you asked yourself, what does this number stuff help us calculate how much omega-6 we should eat in a day? Come on, dude, with funny German accent. Get to the point. Aber natürlich. You see, there is this great guy. Dr. Kenobi also mentioned him a few times. His name is Dr. Stefan Guyanay. He published a paper in 2015 with the title Increase in Adipose Tissue Linoleic Acid of US Adults in the Last Half Century. In this study, Dr. Guyanay conducted a meta-analysis of all the studies that looked at the adipose of people and compared it to their omega-6 intake. This is the study. The study. In this graph, he shows that omega-6 has gone up a lot in our adipose tissue over the years. Impressive, but we kind of expected that, right? Because, as we already know, it accumulates in our body. However, the graph below, this is the money shot.
where the fun begins.
Here, Dr. Guillanet shows a direct and proportional correlation between the ingested omega-6 per year in grams and the percentage of omega-6 in our adipose tissue. So what this means is you can see which amount of omega-6 leads to a certain adipose percentage value. This is exactly the data we needed, the graph we needed. Now it's time to do some shaky calculations based on shaky assumptions. We're gonna take the 7 values that we have and calculate the average out of those numbers. That is 3.2%. That means a healthy, ancestrally eating population should have on average 3.2% of omega-6 in their fat tissue, aka linoleic acid, 3.2%. Now we can simply plug this value in Dr. Guillenet's graph and see what happens, okay? We can do this in 2 ways, geometrically or with algebra. Don't worry, we will go through this stuff in a few seconds. The first way is we do it geometrically. We take the graph, then we extend the correlation line downwards. Then we put our target value of 3.2% on the y-axis. And then, where it crosses the correlation line, we just read the number of the x-axis. And there it is, we got it. The value is 3,750 grams. We divide the 3,750 grams by 365 days and voila, we get about 10 grams a day. A nice solid data point. Or we can do the whole thing with algebra. 10.5 grams. This amount of omega-6 will lead to a very healthy omega-6 concentration in your adipose, the amount that our ancestors had that ate a non-westernized diet. Okay, so this is our end result. You should/could eat a maximum of 10 grams of linoleic acid a day. This is the absolute upper limit, 10 grams a day. Now, with those 10 grams in mind, you should start to assess your very own omega-6 intake. For example, you can use our calculator at RockSolidDiet.com.
You must learn the ways of the Force.
Before we get into the spreadsheet, let's quickly try some nice, easy calculations, okay? First of all, omega-6 is still a fatty acid, so it's a fat. That means if your food doesn't have any fat in it, then there can't be any omega-6 in it too. Second of all, when there's plenty of fat in it, then the percentage of omega-6 counts. To get to the actual omega-6 amount, you just multiply the fat percentage times the omega-6 percentage of that fat.
What are you talking about?
As we said above about fruits and veggies, those are all very lean, and so it does not really matter if the percentage of the omega-6 within the food is high. An apple, for example, has 0.2% of fat. Of that fat, 25% is omega-6, which is pretty high, as you have seen with the seed oil graph, comparable with canola oil. However, as there is almost no fat in the apple, you won't get hardly any omega-6 out of it, even if the omega-6 percentage is 25. A big 150 gram apple is 0.2 grams of fat, which equals 0.3 grams of fat total. These 0.3 grams times the 25% of omega-6 is 0.08 grams of omega-6. This tiny amount of omega-6 is more or less representative of all fruits and veggies.
Good food.
Now let's take some nuts, like peanuts. Okay, you're not gonna eat 150 grams of peanuts, right? Maybe 50 grams. A nice little snack. What is the fat content of peanuts? 50%. And the omega-6 content? 32%. So once more, we do a very simple multiplication. 50 grams times 50% of fat equals 25 grams of fat. Multiplied with 32% of omega-6s, that is a nice and sweet 8 grams of omega-6. Yummy. Remember, we were shooting for a max of 10 grams a day. So we're already almost at our limit with just this single snack of nuts.
This is madness.
And what about a couple of tablespoons of our beloved sunflower oil? Yeah, it's super duper healthy. For sure, that can't hurt that much. Just 3 tablespoons. Again, the calculation goes 50 grams times 100% of fat, because oil is 100% fat, times 62% of omega-6 equals 31 grams. Let's put this into perspective. Let's put this next to each other. This is the apple, tiny 0.08 grams. And here is the peanuts, an impressive 8 grams. I will put a mark here at our 10 grams limit. And the sunflower oil. Let's see. Yeah, I would say this is a lot of omega-6 coming from 3 tablespoons of vegetable oil, exceeding your absolute upper limit by a pretty 300%. So obviously avoid all seed oils in its pure form. That's the biggest chunk and the easiest one to avoid. Alrighty, finally it's time for the calculator. Just go to my website RockSolidDiet.com and download the thing. Be sure to be logged into your Google account and then you can just get a copy of the calculator. This copy then belongs to you. You can make all kinds of changes and tweaks and you can also give it to your friends. So go get it, RockSolidDiet.com.
RockSolidDiet.com. Maybe the force is strong with this one. Okay, omega-6 calculator. Yes, give me my copy. What? My Google account? Email address? I don't really remember. Let's try this one. Yes. I already feel the power of this site. Not bad. Oh, fresh meat.
Okay, so now that you have a copy of the calculator, you can start getting familiar with the interface. On the left we have our 6 food groups: meat and fish, dairy and eggs, vegetables and fruit, oils, fats and nuts, and grains, rice and potatoes. And then, as number 6, I created a category called processed foods to give you quick access to our big sinners. Every category has, of course, a bunch of subcategories. For example, in the meat department you can choose from beef, pork and chicken. Then finally you can choose your specific food item. Before we start using the calculator, let's quickly summarize what's going to happen here. The end result is pretty obvious. We wanna know how much omega-6 is in our food, in our meal, in the most simple terms, in grams. So that's exactly what these two charts are showing you. How many grams of your 10 gram limit you have already spent. Okay, let's set everything to 0 and start over. In step 1 and 2, you choose your category and your food item. Let's have a nice 100 gram burger patty. Step 3 is the amount in grams. Okay, 100 grams, alright. That is about 3.5 ounces. If you wanna enter the weight as ounces, we got you covered. On the homepage we also have an ounces calculator. In step 4 we can vary the units. Let's say you're gonna have 2 hamburger patties with 100 grams each. The result? Those 2 patties contain 0.8 grams of omega-6. Now we still have 9.2 grams left, if we wanna go to the max. Here you can see your calories and your grams of protein, as well as the sum of those things down below. I put the target calories to 2200 and the target protein to 120 grams. This would be like a classic weight loss diet for a male that normally eats 3000 calories a day. This graph here on the left shows you the calories and this one here shows you your protein. In step 5 and 6 you can change those values to your liking. Then, according to your new numbers, the graphs will change as well. And here you could also change your omega-6 amount. Maybe you're a female and think that only 8 grams should be your maximum instead of 10. So that's no problem, you can just change it to 8. Okay, let's continue with our 10 grams. 2 burger patties are not really that fun to eat without anything else, right? Also, you wanna hit your calorie goal and your protein goal. So let's go ahead and make it a burger. 2 burgers, adding 2 70 gram buns. We go to grains, wheat products and get our buns. Alright, 70 grams times 2. Those 2 buns give us an additional 1.1 grams of omega-6. That's because of the seed oils used in the dough. Okay, this is about 900 calories. Let's try to hit our calorie goal. I guess that 5 hamburgers would be fine. Let's see. Let's put the units to 5 each. Alrighty, we're at 2200 calories now, and we also hit our protein goal. And the most important thing, we are far below our omega-6 max. We only ate about 5 grams, so that's an excellent result. With eating 5 hamburgers a day. Yeah, it seems like a trashy diet, I know, but as you're eating only beef, it works, although you had some buns with veggie oil in it. Let's try to change the meat source. Let's change the beef for ground pork. What's gonna happen? Oh, that's what's gonna happen. Simply going from the beef fat to the pork fat increases the omega-6 content like crazy. As you can see here, this omega-6 per 100 gram section, it went from 0.4 to 3.4, meaning 100 grams of ground pork has 3.4 grams of omega-6 in it. Consequently, those 500 grams now result in 17 grams of linoleic acid. And that's already, of course, 70% over our max. You can also open this area up to see what's happening below the hood.
Hello, what have we here?
Here is your classic macros, and here is the 17% omega-6 value of pork fat that we were speaking about. When we switch back to the beef, it shows the great benefit of ruminant meat. The fat of the hamburger has only 2.1% of omega-6 in it. You should just simply go there and play around with this calculator. Put in some items and some dishes that you like and then just compare them. As an example, what about a classic dish from the bodybuilding community? Chicken breast, broccoli and rice. Let's put this dish in, keeping the calories and protein in mind. Okay, so the chicken...
I find your lack of beef disturbing.
Let's just keep it at 500 grams, okay? That's a lot of protein and still very little of omega-6, because the chicken breast is so lean. In the 100 grams, it only has 0.7 grams of it, so you don't have to skip chicken completely. It still depends on the fattiness of the cut. I guess 160 grams of protein is fine. Let's have 500 grams of broccoli. Now we can play with the carbs to get to our caloric target. Okay, at 500 grams of cooked rice, we still have plenty of calories to go. Let's try 1 kilogram of cooked rice. Okay, we got it. 2200 calories, loads of protein, and still we end up with only 4.5 grams of omega-6. Great! Here on the right hand side you can open this area up for additional information about the macros. Here we have the grams of fat and the grams of carbs. Wow, we're at about 300 grams of carbs. Yeah, the RockSolid diet in its basic form is not necessarily a low carb diet. Let's see what the processed foods category can do. Let's have a party pizza with pepperoni for 2200 calories, just for fun. Changing everything to 0, well, you only have to change the units to 0. Go to savory and here it is, pizza pepperoni. One of those pizzas usually has about 400 grams. Let's see what the calories are gonna be. Okay, about 1000. Uh-oh, we're already at 7.8 grams of omega-6. Getting to 2200 calories will yield... yeah, 17 grams. Again, 70% over our max, I'm afraid. Yes, this is junk food without any nutrients. Everybody knows that. But another reason why pizza is junk food is this one. The omega-6 load. If you don't care about nutrients, on paper, pizza is not that bad. We almost hit our protein goal and we did hit our calorie target. But the omega-6s are just way too much. Below the processed foods, I also added a category called every item. This comes in handy if you want to make some quick comparisons. I think that's enough as a basic introduction to our calculator. We will talk about advanced features in a different video, like entering individual values or editing the database. With this knowledge and our calculator, you can easily manage your omega-6 intake. Give it a shot. RockSolidDiet.com.
Now I am the master.
All this excitement has overrun the circuits in my counterpart here.
you came from. But from now on...
Watch this. This is interesting.
Watch what?
RockSolid Diet.
Come on. You'll get it.
I better.
You will.
Do.
Here's a short glimpse into the research that we were referring to at the beginning of the video. This 2004 study shows how a diet high in seed oils damages the mitochondria of animals. A brief episode of STZ-induced hyperglycemia produces cardiac abnormalities in rats fed a diet rich in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Materials and methods. To investigate potential beneficial effects of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA, male Wistar rats, 220 to 240 grams, were first fed an N6 PUFA diet, supplemented with 20% sunflower oil. Energy contribution from fats in this diet was 40% of total energy intake, similar to human consumption. Feeding 20% sunflower oil successfully magnified the omega-6 PUFA content in the heart, mainly linoleic and arachidonic acid. In Figure 1a, you can see the big increase in omega-6 content due to the excess consumption of polyunsaturated plant fats. Cardiolipin and mitochondrial morphology. Cardiolipin is a mitochondrial membrane phospholipid that is essential for optimal functioning of oxidative phosphorylation enzyme complexes and ATP generation. Structural damage to the mitochondria is associated with derangements in fuel utilization. Disappearance of total cardiolipin resulted in loss of oxidative phosphorylation activity and could explain the drop in mitochondrial ATP synthesis. Total cardiolipin decreased almost sixfold after omega-6 PUFA feeding, with a significant drop of ATP only in PUFA diet hearts. In Figure 5a, we see the negative impact of PUFA feeding on the cardiolipin structure of the mitochondria. Glucose and palmitate oxidation. Inasmuch as condensed mitochondria suggest lack of energy production, glucose and palmitate oxidation in the isolated heart were studied in parallel with heart function. In the PUFA diet group, glucose oxidation dropped further compared with the ND and PC groups. In Figure 6a, we see the consequence of the destruction of the cardiolipin structure. The ability of the mitochondria to burn glucose as fuel has almost gone to zero. Furthermore, this tiny level of substrate oxidation stayed more or less the same, even when the heart had to burn significantly more fuel for higher physical loads, as seen in Figure 6b. Inasmuch as changes in cardiolipin have also been associated with mitochondrial structural alterations, we scrutinized mitochondrial morphology in all the above groups. Figure 5a depicts a mitochondrion with a double membrane and lamellar cristae, which are typical in NC, ND, and PC hearts, meaning all of the other study groups except the PUFA group. A novel observation in this study was abnormal condensed mitochondria, but only in the PD group, the polyunsaturated fats diet group. See Figure 5b. Figure 5. Biochemical and ultrastructural changes in cardiac mitochondria after PUFA feeding. A on the left and B at the right. Representative electron micrographs of myocytes, showing normal and condensed mitochondria respectively. Some condensed mitochondria were observed only in PUFA diet hearts. Summary. In animals, a diet high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, in this case sunflower oil, led to these issues: an increase in omega-6 content, a sharp decline of cardiolipin, a drastic reduction of glucose metabolism, caused by morphological and functional changes of the mitochondria. As Dr. Seyfried fans, you all know that this situation constitutes the precursor, maybe even the cause of cancer, as the inability to burn glucose for fuel is the hallmark of cancer, i.e. Warburg effect. Thus, avoiding omega-6 fats is essential to keep your mitochondria healthy and to prevent cancer. If you want to implement the RockSolid Diet into your cancer management protocol, just go to school.com/keto for cancer, our new online community and education platform.